it seems to be a recurring theme in this episode that I just keep saying things don't occur in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so things don't occur in a vacuum. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Debatable with your hosts, Nina and Kyle. I'm Kyle.
I'm Nina.
We're finally done with finals week.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're back.
We're back.
Ready to record again and stuff. Kyle's free from law school for now. And I just submitted my final paper yesterday. I'm done with college.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, he has to grade it first, so we'll see, but I'm optimistic.
So we decided to make it up to you guys for not uploading so often. We're going to upload
a lot.
more frequently.
Yeah.
Yeah, than before. So we're gonna start today with the next episode in our extension series, and then after that we're going to start uploading our new series about the elections, recently concluded elections, which will be great because we also interviewed some debaters that you might know.
Yeah, and other people outside of the debate community, which will be rather interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, so extensions, part 2?
Just to recap from the first part, the last time we talked about different types of extensions.
The forms.
We also talked about how to run pragmatic and principled extensions. What we're gonna do in this episode is to talk about more strategies on how to come up with extensions. We're gonna talk about scale extensions. We're gonna talk about timeline extensions. We're gonna talk about theme extensions. And finally, we're gonna talk about tips.
Mm-hmm. I've honestly kind of forgotten what we did like 3 weeks ago. So if you have time, I suggest you recap on the previous episode because this is just an extension of that extensions. Whoa.
Wow.
Okay. Scale extensions, what are they, Kyle?
Scale extensions are extensions that depend on how big or small the actor that you're representing in the argument is. So if you're extending for an opening team that tried to go large scale with their arguments, scale extension would be to scale down and look at smaller individual actors. So the importance of this is to say that, we're talking about the actors are primarily affected by these particular policies, which are the individuals. On the other hand, if you're extending for a team that goes small scale, you can choose to go large scale in your extension. So you can talk about the societal effects, like the culture that affects more people in the long run. So on a very basic level, you want to look at the type of actor that they're discussing and try to look at the types of actors that they're not discussing.
Yeah, so there's multiple ways to do this actually. But I think what's important to note before we break those down further is that there is a finesse to this. So if you're talking about large scale actors, then you have to first prove to us why it's important to talk about the large-scale institutions instead of just the individuals. But I would say would be an individual is just a cog in a greater machine, or they're just a part of a bigger whole, so it's important to see what whole they're part of. But you can also go reverse and say that institutions are just the sum of its people, or made up of individuals. So make sure you never forget to prove the importance of why you want to extend in that particular way. Because as we noted in the first episode, having an extension and having something new doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win the round.
So in order to really understand what I mean by scale extensions, I want to take a look at the link between what I call macro-level institutions and micro-level institutions. So we're taking a look at basically relationships between large and small actors. So when we talk about macro institutions, these are those really big institutions that are not, you don't necessarily think of them as just individuals. You think of them as more like concepts, like the state, the government, economy.
Culture, tribes.
Culture, yeah, exactly. So there are a few things that I wanna have you guys remember when we talk about macro institutions. First is that they don't operate in a vacuum. They operate under a system that we call relative autonomy. And what I mean by this is that even though you have macro institutions that want to be independent of one another, they constantly check and balance each other. They constantly affect how the other is doing. So if you look at, for example, the 3 branches of government, you have the executive, legislative, and the judiciary. Mm-hmm. They are 3 separate and co-equal branches of government, but it doesn't mean that they cannot affect each other in any particular way. The judiciary can always review the decisions of the legislative and the executive. The executive can veto particular pieces of legislation. The legislature can impeach impeachable officers. So you also look at the relationship between the church and the state, because even though they are quote unquote separate, you just can't deny that there are overlaps between the two. And even if you look at corporations, if you treat them as macro level institutions, they compete against one another, even though they're supposed to be independent, and that's where you get competition. Another thing that you have to remember is that you have something called institutional design, where their actions are limited because of like the way that they're structured and because of rules and formats and certain procedural requirements. So again, on the branches of government thing, I always get confused when people go like, oh, but the Supreme Court can just overrule this or whatever, because actually there are certain like requirements that you need to fulfill in order for there to be what we call judicial review, or reviewing the validity or constitutionality of a particular enactment or government action. And so like you need to take a look at the way that that organization is structured, because that's also the way that you can understand why it behaves the way that it does.
So institutional design really just looks at rules, because institutions at its core are just a set of rules, whether they're written or unwritten. So if they're written like laws, they're called parchment institutions. If they're not, they're called unwritten institutions. And what are unwritten institutions that also govern even branches of government is culture. Like there's a culture, for example, of when it's proper to impeach and not impeach. That's not just defined by rules. Sometimes there are political reasons for impeachment. Sometimes there are political reasons for passing policies or vetoing policies, right? And sometimes you don't always see these because they're not written down. But they're also important to note, and that's also an angle you might want to explore when discussing macro institutions, rather.
Finally, you want to take a look at how they change. So macro institutions generally are not static. They generally change through time depending on their particular needs. So you want to look at, again, the state, but more importantly, you can look at things like religion. What might be important to note here is, even though macro institutions generally change over time, the rate at which they change might not necessarily be the same. So what you want to do is to take a look at what are the barriers towards change and why those barriers are meant to stay or not stay in the case of religion, or, for example, in motions about changing the constitution every few years or through referendum. Why is it okay that the Constitution essentially places a barrier on changing itself? Because you can only change the Constitution in a particular manner, and you can't just change the Constitution willy-nilly. So why is it that some macro-level institutions are more likely to change and other institutions are less likely to change? And what is the value of those barriers?
Yeah, so 3 things to note for macro institutions: the relative autonomy, the structure or institutional design, and as Kyle just mentioned, structural change.
Next, let's discuss micro-level institutions. So while macro institutions talk about the dynamics between big institutions like government, states, micro-level institutions are most likely the families, ganyan.
People.
Literally people.
Yeah.
The micro-level institutions. So I want to take a look at the dynamics between individuals. There are, again, a few things that you can take away from this. The first one is, again, relative autonomy. I think we of all people already know that our choices are not made like in a vacuum. Our choices are constantly affected by a variety of factors, and most of the time those factors include other people as well. And what's important to note here is, it's when you look at micro-level institutions that power dynamics mostly comes into play. Because when you take a look at bigger institutions, macro-level institutions, they most of the time have a comparable level of power. But for micro-level institutions, you always have people who have more power compared to others. So you talk about families, you talk about politicians and their constituents, these types of things. So what you want to take a look at is the type of power dynamics that exists in this relationship and how those affect outcomes and behaviors. Another thing that we like to talk about is rational choice. And rational choice is all about preferences. And this is where you want to argue the step-by-step analysis as to why a particular actor will do a particular thing. So, rational choice theory presupposes that an individual has preferences, and that person will act according to those preferences to maximize that person's level of happiness.
So the best example here, and the one that usually comes up in debates, are politicians. And their main rational choice is often to get themselves re-elected. So you could argue that a lot of their outcomes are because of their overall objective of getting another seat in power or maintaining their quote-unquote legacy when it comes to government.
The other episode, we were talking about why a politician is more likely to cater to make policies that cater to prisoners if prisoners are allowed to vote.
Yeah.
And this precisely because the individual politician, prefers to get reelected and prefers to cater to sectors of the voting population by giving policies that cater to them. Finally, we can talk about also irrational behavior. I particularly think that they're just irrational, and that's valid. But Nina likes to think of it as an irrational response to a rational concern. So we have talked about hyper insecurity in this podcast before, which is basically an irrational response to a valid concern about getting replaced or your interests not being represented as much anymore. So again, you want to take a look at what those preferences are and why it leads to a rational decision or why it leads to an irrational behavior.
Yeah. This is why a lot of men don't like feminist policies and they become hyper insecure because their fear, and they're not just women haters as much as it's easier to term them that way, but really they have a valid concern, quote unquote, or as much valid as it can be, that they're afraid of losing their position of power. So they irrationally respond by lashing out at women or preventing any progress for the other groups that may topple them in the end.
So that's what we have for micro-level institutions. I'm sure there are more ways that you can extend using micro-level institutions. But I think what's the most important part about this segment of the episode is to talk about the links between micro-level institutions and macro-level institutions. Because again, I said, they don't exist in a vacuum from one another. Macro institutions don't exist in a vacuum from other macro institutions. Micro institutions don't exist in a vacuum from other micro institutions. But macro institutions don't exist in a vacuum without micro level institutions as well. And there are like a variety of implications for this. First is that, as Nina already foreshadowed earlier, you can consider macro level institutions to be just bureaucratized, versions of micro-level interactions. So, you have things like the state, which mediates, for example, conflicts between individual people. You have the legislature, which is sort of like a more formal way for the electorate to bring their own interests into Congress or Senate. Wait, no, Congress and Senate are the same.
Yes.
Yeah. So the legislature is just a more bureaucratized way of getting the electorate to get their interests into Congress, things like that. It also means that a change in micro-level transactions can lead to changes in macro-level institutions as well. So if you want to take a look at, for instance, the change between racist policies in the past and more race-neutral policies of the present, or race-positive policies of the present or even the future, right? What happened there was a change in how the micro-level institutions interacted and like believed in. So, and the things that the micro-level institutions believed in, such that it eventually translated to a change in the macro institution that we call the state, laws, etc. But also, you also want to take a look at non-compliance. And this is where you have macro-level institutions that set a particular set of rules for micro-level institutions, and those people don't comply with those rules. What happens is there'll eventually be consequences, because it's only because there are consequences that the macro-level institution gets to set all these rules in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's important to take a look at what those consequences are and why that necessarily makes the micro-level institution behave in a certain way. Finally, you have this notion of a macro-level institution pressuring a micro-level institution to do a particular thing. So this is an extension of power dynamics. So earlier I said that for a micro-level institution, other micro-level institutions can exert power over others. So you have parents exerting their power and influence over their children. But you also have the same thing with macro-level institutions exerting their power over micro-level institutions. This is the reason why there are lots of policies that are neutral when you first look at them, but they exert really bad or insidious pressures on minority groups or oppressed groups, right? So the main lesson that you get from this is that micro-level institutions, like people in general, they are producers of macro-level institutions, and they're also products of macro-level institutions. So I read this quote from an anthro class before, where people say that we are both producers and products of our own cultures. So I think that's, like, if you could sum it all up, the links, that's what it means. We are both producers and products of our own macro-level institutions.
Yeah, so that's basically it for the new way to extend. You can look at micro, macro scale, or what we call scale extensions in this way. Another way that you can look at scale extension is through looking at an individual lens. So, again, this is sort of similar to micro institutions because we're also talking about people, but we'd say it's a lot smaller because instead of looking at small institutions, you're looking at literally one part of that institution, which we call an individual. And there are multiple ways by which you are able to approach this. And you usually ask yourself, which small actor do you focus on? So the first way you can do it is by actor analysis. And there are two styles to approaching this. You can either talk about a new actor altogether, which is rather common in debates, especially if you're an extension speaker. For example, your opening half in a feminist motion talks about, obviously, women and feminist groups. You, as an extension speaker, can talk about other actors that are involved as well, other individuals. So I would probably talk about men, how they're affected by this policy, or the children of those women, etc. Another way is to look at the same actor, but look at a different spectrum of that actor. So you could still extend by talking about feminists, but you can look at a different type of feminists. So if your opening half just talks about women as a whole, you can perhaps break that down and talk about conservative women or liberal women and how they particularly are affected by the motion or the policy that's being proposed by your opponent or even by your own team.
Let's assume you already have the new actor, right? You have a new actor in mind. How are you going to pull it off? There are three general steps. The first is you have to step into the mindset of that new actor that you're representing. Step into the shoes of that actor, and this is where, like, all the talk about how debate creates empathy and those types of things comes in. Because in order for you to understand how to run that argument using these lens, you also need to take a look at what the interests of that actor are. So it's not enough for you to say, oh, we're going to talk about conservative feminists today. You also have to talk about what are the interests of conservative feminists to begin with. Second, you need to give a step-by-step analysis on how they'll be affected by this policy and why that's bad or not, or a step-by-step analysis on how they are likely going to behave given this policy. So if you have this feminism motion and you're talking about men being more insecure or less insecure because of this policy, talk about a step-by-step process on how, like, they're going to behave because of this policy. So, I know that lots of people don't like Meninists, but I have used the lens of Meninists in the past. Just because you disagree with them shouldn't prevent you from trying to step into their shoes. Because as Nina already said before, even though these are irrational, they still have valid concerns. And you want to represent them as well, just to be fair to everyone involved. Or if not, like, you can say their voices aren't as valuable as others in this debate.
Yeah, but I would say that the reason we need to talk about them is because they are influential. And even if we don't agree with them, it's important to see where they're coming from to better stop them in the future or to curtail the damages that they may cause, right?
Yeah, that's precisely the last step, which is to talk about the importance of this particular actor's perspective. So, as what Nina said, a lot of the time, Meninists are, like, even though we disagree with them, They're very patriarchal. They're still the people who are in the positions of power that you're trying to vie for, who you're trying to influence to get better policies in the future, etc. Next, we can talk about movements also. And this is different from an individual lens. You can use a movement lens. And the thing about movements is that I think they're a special actor because there are macro level institutions with respect to individuals. So an individual feminist might look at the feminist movement as a macro level institution. But at the same time, movements are micro level institutions with respect to
The state.
like the state.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that more than any other actor, when it comes to movements, you can use all the other different frameworks that we've used in this episode to apply to movements. But more than that, you can just check out episode 2 where we talk about how it's a process, it's a performance, it's a method, and sort of just incorporate all the new things that you've learned from this episode.
Yeah, so we won't really delve into this because we've already discussed that thoroughly. If you're interested, you can just look back at episode 2 after this podcast episode. Okay, the next lens that you can look at is the lens of the state, which is another form of macro institution that we've already foreshadowed earlier. But I think what's important to note about the state is that they have really, really strong power in comparison to most other actors. Maybe they're just weak compared to the international actor we'll be discussing later anyway. But it's also important to note that as far as people are concerned, the state is the direct actor that they can more or less influence with their individual actions. So they're usually highly susceptible to change from the micro institution. This is where you see lobbying taking effect. This is where you can see protests taking effect. This is where you can see legislation take effect, etc., etc.
And elections.
Yeah, elections in particular, which we'll be discussing after this. 3 things to note for this. The first would be that the state usually has a set of values, and you can discuss that. So you can actually integrate a principle to the discussion of an actor as well. So what are the state principles? Do the motions agree to it? Does the policy contradict it? Or is it in line? Or is it parallel to what the state already does? The second would be state objectives, which is different from state values, because values are just a set of principles and overarching beliefs that the state has, but objectives are what the state tries to achieve. So perhaps you can talk about why a particular policy helps the state achieve equity or equality or development or progress or peace or maybe even dominance in comparison to other states, etc., etc. And third would be political influence. And this is where we've already kind of talked about this a lot in various episodes and even in earlier parts of this episode. But you have to talk about politicians, you have to talk about government institutions, you also have to talk about intergovernment institutions and how they interact with each other. So again, these aren't new things. I just think that it's important to note that you can separate them into a discussion. Because what happens in most debates is that people just talk in blobs, or they want to talk about a particular thing, but they don't know how to particularly break it down. And that's why it becomes very difficult for people to reach 7 minutes or for them to make it palatable to a judge.
Another thing that you can ask when you're talking about the state is whether or not the state has the right to do a particular action. So you have a lot of motions where a lot of policy debates about sort of infringing upon another person's rights. And the first question that you should ask as, for example, our prime minister, or if the prime minister didn't do it, you should do this. Why does the state even have the right to enact this particular policy? Why does the state have the right to ban inheritance, for example? To what extent should the state even protect property rights? Ganyan. So these things sound very airy-fairy because they're principled, but these are very important questions for you to ask, because if you're going to extend in this way and the opening team didn't talk about why the state has the right to do this, you basically have a means to win that is outcome independent as well. So you can refer back to the first episode.
Wow, there's so many tiebacks here.
So many tiebacks.
Yeah, but I think this just proves that debate and learning debate is a very linked process. You can't learn one thing without learning another, or you do better in one thing if you learn other things as well. So just take everything as a whole. Don't just take this episode in a vacuum. We really recommend you read up more or listen to other episodes in order to better the way you approach particular parts of these tricks and tips that we're giving you. after the state lens, you can also look at the international relations lens, which is particularly my favorite way to extend the debate, especially when it comes to policies, especially when it comes to like movements, etc. So you can look at the reactions of other states, which is the most basic thing to do. For example, if the Philippines has a new, for example, military stance or tactic in terms of governing their own government, does that change the way that China interacts with us? Does that change the way that the US ends up interacting with us? And usually these are harder extensions to kind of create because that requires particular matter. It requires more knowledge of how the rest of the world operates. But again, I think that this is not something you should discount as difficult and therefore undoable. It is doable. It just requires a little bit more finesse in approaching it.
So you're completely correct that you want to talk about the reactions of other states. So remember we did this one round, where we were talking about China, and I said, oh, China allows people to challenge parking tickets now, and before they couldn't.
Yeah.
Like, oh, because now they're sort of transitioning to a more civil society or something like that.
Okay, to be fair, we did that round at the time where Xi Jinping looked promising, but now he's just like another a-hole, so that argument does not apply anymore, but it did at the time. But the point is, it's important to note how other states behave in order to allow your own state to either push through with a policy or not. So it's also kind of important to think about what other countries will think of you.
Yeah, which leads us to the next point, which is you want to take a look at how those relationships change between countries. So there are two steps to this part. You want to take a look at what the relationship between those states was in the past and also how it will change. And maybe as a caveat, like the third step is what will it change into?
Yeah.
So this is important, but it's really tricky because again, you need matter.
Yeah.
But if it's just like a vague thing, it's probably fine also. Like, you don't need to have a lot of matter to know that the United States and China are a bit hostile towards one another.
Yeah.
And peace is important, like that. But finally, I think you want to take a look at something I call General April, which is generally accepted principles of international law.
Wow.
Yeah, that's how I remember that, General April.
Okay.
So with generally accepted principles of international law, these are principles that all states are expected to at least accept or respect. So you want to take a look at how different states, because of their actions, fit themselves within these generally accepted principles. So if you don't know anything about the relationships that one country has to another, you can at least take a look at generally accepted principles, because the actor there that you're trying to take a look at isn't any particular state, but the international community as a whole. So if you follow these generally accepted principles, generally speaking, you have a higher level of respect or clout in the international community.
Yep. So that's a bunch of different ways you can do scale extensions. Like this whole time we were just talking about scale extensions. So recap, for scale extensions, you can either talk about macro institutions, you can look at an individual lens, you can look at the movement lens, you can look at the state lens, and lastly, you can look at the IR lens. So these are really like six lenses actually by which you can approach scale extensions. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's it for that.
Next, let's talk about timeline extensions. It seems to be a recurring theme in this episode that I just keep saying things don't occur in a vacuum. Yeah, so things don't occur in a vacuum, even with respect to time. You have a lot of times that you can argue. So you always have to remember that there is not only a present, but also a past and a future, which sounds amazingly corny. But like, sometimes you really forget that you can talk about the past, you can talk about the future, right? So, take a look at the past. You want to take a look at what I call the historical rootedness of any particular existing dynamic or policy. All of the different things that we talked about in the scale extensions, there is another way to extend those even further by talking about why they became the way that they are. It is important to analyze the current relevance of a particular dynamic. So if it's about repealing a particular law or reintroducing a particular law, you can talk about why in the past you had this law or why was it repealed, etc. Or if you still have this law and you want to repeal it, you want to take a look at why that policy was created to begin with and why those conditions are not the same, or if they did not meet their objectives, or if our priorities have changed right now. So you can talk about the past, and the past is important because it's how you inform the current state of things.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about an IR lens, again, like why did they have this dynamic to begin with? Why are China and the United States at odds with each other? Why is the US and Russia at odds with each other? Why is North Korea acting the way that it is? It's actually because it's trying to hold on to its history in the Cold War, wherein they were actually stronger than the South. So a part of their national identity is historically rooted in opposition to the South and in opposition to the United States. So when you're talking about timeline analysis, it's very important to flesh out what's happening today by taking a look at its historical rootedness. Next, we can talk about the future. So what future goals do we want to reach? What consequences do we want to avoid? And how do we get there? So you have short-term concerns and you have long-term concerns.
Which I think is very common in debates, which I'm particularly happy still comes up, because these are very important things. So short-term, usually what immediately happens in like the next few months or the next year. Long-term would be what happens in the next 3 years. For example, if we're talking about the Philippine elections, you can talk about short-term harms and long-term harms. So short-term harms is obviously that the shift of power becomes more in line with Duterte, that it's less likely now for the opposition to speak out. But you can also talk about what happens in the long term. I would say, optimistically, it means that in the next 3 years, there's more like traction for opposition, that there's more of a necessity for opposition to rise, and therefore they may or may not be successful come the 2022 election, right?
Yeah, another way that you can think about this is that there are some motions or some debates where a team can argue for one but not the other. You can argue for immediacy but not longevity or sustainability.
Yeah.
So for example, a motion about
War?
Or a motion about the opposition rigging
The elections.
Yeah. Or vote buying or whatever. So in the short term, government can argue that, it helps us overthrow or replace an oppressive government as the opposition. But on opposition bench, you can talk about why it's not sustainable for democracies in general, because you set a very bad precedent as to how
to maintain power.
How to maintain power, or every way to get power is now suddenly a legitimate means of getting power.
Yeah, so that's a long-term harm.
Yeah. So you can have both, but if you can't have both and you can only focus on one or the other, it's very important to take a look at why the short term is more important than the long term, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Finally, let's talk about the most vague way to extend the theme extensions. Mm-hmm. So theme extensions is basically the thought process that goes into making an extension where you go, what if there's an econ angle to this?
Yeah,
what if there's a religion angle to this?
Yeah, so when Kyle debates, for example, econ motions, he'll slip in religion, or if there's religion, he'll slip in econ. Or me, that I slip in international relationships in everything. Yes. So basically, this is a more vague way to extend, but it is effective, and you shouldn't just discount it. Just because a theme comes up in a motion set, for example, in every round, before every round comes up, they reveal the theme, right? But don't be confined to that theme. The theme, I would say, is just a guideline. It's not a set rule. So allow yourself to experiment, because in the end, debate is just a game. And debate is something you should have fun with. So if you like talking about IR, go ahead and talk about IR. If you like talking about religion, okay, fine. Talk about religion.
No, but I remember there was this... No, in Point Ma'am, the debate comic, which we love.
Yeah.
There's this one character who just keeps using Marxist extensions all the time. I think that's valid if you pull it off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really a Marxist type of person, then be a Marxist type of person.
Yeah, I mean, the goal of debate is for you to explore your own thought processes and apply them in a intellectual discussion and discourse. Why is there a honking car all the time? I don't like recording here anymore. Basically, sorry, got distracted there. just be creative and have fun. It's usually a running joke that, Marxist extensions never win you around. But they can, and they might one day. So just perfect that method, and eventually you might have a round where a Marxist extension is the winning extension.
So a theme extension, I think, works the best if you have a lot of knowledge on multiple themes, right? Because that's where you can like scroll through the list of themes. Like, is there an econ? No. Is there a religion? Is there an IR angle? Is there a politics angle?
So shout out to SPCP, because my kids and our kids, sorry, I was just claiming monopoly for our children. Our kids enjoy discussing the education angle, because education is their favorite theme, and it did become effective. Like, we teamed up with Jillian Sandigan for Mint a few months ago, and there was a motion about changing the percentage based on your age for when you vote. For example, if you're younger, your vote weighs more compared to when you're older. And I was the first speaker for our team, and she was the deputy, and she thought of an extension about how it improves voter education, because now we're incentivized to teach kids at a younger age, like, the proper way to vote, about politics, etc. And I'm like, hey, it's very good.
Could have been more proud.
I'm very proud.
Very proud.
Right? So that just proves that you shouldn't be confined. Like, it was a politics motion, but she managed to slip in education one way or another, and we won that round. So just keep that in mind when you make your extensions. So the last thing we want to do is give you a bunch of tips, and we've been kind of dropping them here and there for this whole 2 episodes, but we'll just give you a rundown. I'd say let's just give them 3 tips for extending. Yeah?
Okay,
3 tips. We're making this as we go.
So number 1, I think when you want to take a look at whether or not your extension is good or not, I don't think it's sufficient for you to just say, I have something new, and call it a day. You have to introduce it by talking about what the debate currently lacks.
Yeah.
So this takes a lot of practice, because you're gonna have to listen to a debate and then think about, ano ba kulang?
Yeah.
But if you're a more skilled debater, or you can at least just try to make it seem like the debate is missing this particular thing, even if it's not really.
Not really important, maybe, or not really missing. But there's a way to pull it off. It's called hijacking, and Kyle does that a lot. It's the reason I didn't like him so much first year college. But it's an effective strategy, as much as I hate to admit it. So that's the first tip. I think the second tip would be to matter load. I think you shouldn't just be reliant on rhetoric, and shouldn't be reliant on these podcast episodes. Read up, because there's a lot of different perspectives that we probably weren't able to tackle because we haven't read enough, right? So you'd want to be that person that introduces new ideas to a round that are not just intuitive things, but things that are particular to the motion. So if you have specialized knowledge on China for a motion about China, bring that out. And if you have specialized knowledge about religion during a religion round, bring that out. I think if you have an opportunity to shine with the matter that you really geek out about, then now's the time to do it.
Finally, I think a very important thing that you should always remember is to just experiment. So earlier, I've been talking about how you can have a timeline analysis alongside micro analysis, and all these different types of lens. You can use a whole different bunch of ways to analyze them. And the reason why that works is because what I'm basically doing is I'm getting information from different places and then incorporating them into new ideas, and you're creating something new out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically how discourse is supposed to work.
Yeah.
You're getting different perspectives and you're getting new ideas out of them.
Yeah.
This is also why I highly, highly encourage you to have fun with the theme extensions. I don't want to say pilitin or force it, but sometimes it really forces you to be creative. This one time, someone challenged me to make a religion extension from an econ motion, and I got an 82.
Nice tie back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think debate is like cooking. Just mix things together that you think might work well, and you might get yourself a nice dish. But dapat hindi luto. Charot.
What?
I don't know what I'm saying anymore. Basically,
how is it cooking but it's not cooked?
No, luto kasi means rigged, right? I was making wordplay on that word.
Yeah, but the second wordplay does not fit into the first wordplay.
Okay, fine.
Okay, that's it for this episode.
Bye!